Welcome to another deep dive, this time into the nature versus nurture debate. We got some excerpts from The Nurture Assumption by Judith Rich Harris, and
It's a fascinating book.
it is. It's really interesting. I
Yeah.
mean, this book really kind of flips the script on how we think about child development. We're going to explore some alternative explanations for how kids become who they are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how deeply ingrained the belief is, that parents are the primary architects of their children's personalities. And she really goes after that in a bold way, suggesting that while genes certainly play a part, the child's peer group might actually have more influence.
Hmm. It's definitely a thought-provoking idea. I
Right.
mean, she doesn't shy away from shaking things up.
Right.
One of the things that kind of jumped out at me was her observation about eating habits and how there's not a lot of long-term influence from parents on that. She uses the example of adult adoptees
Yeah.
whose eating habits end up resembling their biological parents
Right,
more
yeah.
than their adoptive ones.
It really challenges the notion that you could spend years, carefully curating your child's meals and that would translate into lifelong preferences for them.
Right.
And she argues that, we've come a long way in our understanding of genetics, but we're sort of clinging to this idea that parents are all powerful.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into this a little more. If parents aren't the primary force, then how does she explain all this evidence, that people have used to support the idea that they are for so long?
Well, she actually dissects some of the methodology that's used, in these traditional socialization studies. And she points out some flaws. Like many of these studies rely on parental reports, which can be subjective,
Oh, totally.
right? Or they observe the children in the home environment exclusively.
Hmm.
And she makes the analogy that that's kind of like, if you were trying to understand the behavior of a fish and you only observed it in a tank,
Right.
you're going to miss out on all the nuances of how it behaves, in a larger school.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. You need the full context to understand behavior. So what does she propose as an alternative to these flawed approaches to this research?
Well, she points to the behavioral genetic studies, which are designed to untangle the contributions of genes and environment.
Right.
And these studies consistently show that heredity accounts for roughly 50% of the variation.
So we're looking at about 50-50.
Yeah, roughly 50-50.
But how do you separate those influences? I mean, if genes and environment are so intertwined.
That's the crux of it, right? And Harris stresses that it's so important to control for those genetic influences when you're trying to study environmental effects.
Okay.
She points out that correlational studies, for example, are limited because they just show relationships between variables.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you find that friendly parents tend to have friendly children, it's hard to say whether it's the parenting style that's causing that or simply shared genes.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation.
Yeah.
But what about the cases of identical twins separated at birth and raised in completely different environments?
Yeah.
I mean, don't those stories really point to this incredible power of genes?
Well, she does go into some fascinating accounts of these separated twin studies. Like, she talks about the two Jims, for example.
Oh, yeah.
These twins were separated at birth, and they shared so many uncanny similarities, from nail-biting habits to a passion for woodworking to even driving the same car model.
Wow.
And then there was another case of Jack Youth and Oscar Storr, who were separated as infants and raised on different continents.
Wow.
And they shared all these peculiar habits like flushing the toilet before using it and sneezing in elevators.
It's almost eerie to hear how similar they are, despite their vastly different upbringings.
Yeah.
Are there any instances where the results of these twin studies weren't as clear-cut?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. She presents the case of Amy and Beth, who were separated twins, but they both developed these same unusual cognitive and personality deficits, despite having very different childhood experiences. And these variations within twin studies really do raise some intriguing questions about whether genes are the whole story.
Yeah, so even with identical genes, we're not seeing these perfectly identical outcomes.
Hmm.
Clearly, there's more to this puzzle. So if it's not just parents and the power of genes isn't absolute, then what's the missing piece? What is she saying?
She's saying,
Yeah.
well, she really takes on this idea of birth order,
Okay.
the impact of birth order.
Yeah, I grew up with that whole thing, for firstborns are responsible, the younger siblings are more rebellious.
Right, exactly.
Is there any truth to that?
Well, she challenges that pretty directly. She argues against the idea that, older siblings are naturally more responsible and achievement-oriented and that younger siblings are inherently more rebellious and creative.
So much for those, like, family dynamics theories.
Yeah.
But it raises an interesting question then. If birth order isn't the reliable predictor of personality, how do you explain those differences we often see between siblings who grow up in the same home?
Right. Well, that's where she introduces this really interesting concept of children developing these different selves or personas based on the environment that they're in.
Okay.
Like think about Cinderella,
Right.
meek and submissive at home, but then playful and carefree with her friends.
Yeah.
And kids are actually remarkably adept at this code switching.
Yeah.
They adjust their behavior based on the social context.
It's like they're navigating all these different worlds, right?
Yeah.
Each with its own rules and expectations.
Yeah.
So how does this code switching tie into her central argument?
Well, this adaptability is key to understanding the power of peer groups.
Oh.
Because Harris believes that children are primarily socialized by their peers, not by their parents. They absorb the culture of their peers, their language, their behaviors, and ultimately shape their own identities based on those interactions.
So it's less about what's happening at home and more about the dynamics of the playground.
Yeah.
Are you saying parents have like minimal impact?
Well, parents provide that initial environment, the language and culture of the home.
Well, once the child steps outside of that and interacts with peers, those influences can really shift dramatically. Think about immigrant children, for example,
Right.
who quickly assimilate into the dominant culture, often, much to the chagrin of their parents who are trying to preserve their heritage.
Right.
Or you look at deaf children who develop sign language despite being taught spoken English. These are really compelling examples of the pull of peer groups.
Yeah, it's like this silent revolution where they're adopting and perpetuating cultural norms through these interactions, almost independent of their parents. It makes you wonder if all those parenting books out there promising to mold, your child into a certain personality are maybe overselling their impact.
Well, she's certainly skeptical of those kinds of claims.
Okay.
She points out that parenting advice has swung so wildly over the years, from strict discipline to permissive parenting and everything in between.
Yeah.
And yet children continue to develop these unique personalities regardless of what the latest parenting trend is. Right, so those carefully crafted timeouts and, reward systems might have less long-term influence than parents hope for. But what about the research that links parental influence to things like teenage delinquency or, the challenges faced by children of divorce? How does she address those sorts of arguments?
Well, she directly challenges those assumptions, too. She suggests that, for example, teenage delinquency
Good.
often stems from peer group dynamics rather than parental failings.
Interesting.
Teenagers are so driven by that need to fit in, that need to rebel against authority, and that can lead them, into risky behavior or even criminal behavior.
Right.
But it's not necessarily a reflection of bad parenting.
Right.
It's more about the complexities of adolescence and the influence of peers.
Yeah, it's a very different way of framing those turbulent teenage years. Less about parental blame and more about the social forces at play. What about the challenges faced by children from single-parent homes? How does she approach that one?
She argues that the negative outcomes that are often associated with children, raised in single-parent homes, might actually be more related to socioeconomic factors than the absence of a father.
Okay.
Because divorce often leads to a decline in the family's standard of living,
Right.
which impacts everything from their housing to their access to educational resources. So it's those factors more so than just family structure alone that can really impact a child's well-being.
So it's really about understanding that broader context
Mm-hmm.
and acknowledging the social and economic realities that can shape a child's life rather than just attributing outcomes solely to family structure. It makes you rethink some of those assumptions we take for granted. But if we're acknowledging that parents may have less control than we once believed, where does that leave us? What does this mean for how we approach things like education or social interventions?
Those are really important questions because if children are being socialized primarily by their peers, then how can we use that understanding to create, positive and supportive environments for them to learn and grow? Should we be shifting our focus to, fostering positive group dynamics and a sense of belonging?
It's almost like we need to shift from trying to micromanage every aspect of a child's life to creating this sort of nurturing ecosystem where they can learn and thrive through their interactions with peers. But wouldn't that suggest then that children from the same neighborhood would end up more alike than they are?
Mm-hmm.
How does she address that question of individual differences?
That's a great point. Even within a peer group, children are constantly observing, comparing, differentiating themselves.
Yeah.
They're trying to figure out where they fit in, they're exploring their unique traits, they're discovering what sets them apart. It's not about becoming carbon copies of each other. It's
Yeah.
about navigating this social landscape while simultaneously developing a sense of self.
It's like they're absorbing the culture of the group while simultaneously forging their own individual paths.
Hmm.
It's this fascinating dance between conformity and individuality.
Hmm.
But how do we account for those individual differences? What's driving those unique expressions of self?
Well, that question kind of goes beyond the scope of what the nurture assumption is trying to address.
Yeah.
She acknowledges that we still have a lot to learn about this complex interplay of genes and environment and individual experiences.
Yeah.
But one thing that's clear is that that traditional model of, parental influence as the primary driver of personality development needs a serious rethink.
So maybe instead of striving to mold our children into these miniature versions of ourselves, we should focus more on, providing environments where they can explore their individuality, connect with peers who share their interests, and develop the resilience they need to navigate, all the complexities of social life.
Yeah, that's a really profound insight. And it kind of brings us back to this core message of the nurture assumption. That by understanding the true dynamics of child development, by recognizing the power of peer groups, and by acknowledging the limits of parental control, we can maybe develop a more realistic and supportive approach to raising the next generation.
It's like a call to re-examine our assumptions
Mhm.
and to, appreciate this sort of intricate tapestry of influences that shape who we become. But before we wrap up our exploration of the nurture assumption, I have one final thought for you to ponder. If kids are truly shaped more by their peers than we thought, what does that mean for us as adults? Are we all just products of our social groups destined to, just follow the norms of our tribes?
Well, that question really gets to the heart of the nature versus nurture debate. The nurture assumption doesn't offer all the answers, but it does give us this powerful new lens for understanding just how much those social groups really do influence human behavior.
It's a real shift in perspective, isn't it? Instead of focusing solely on how our parents or genes shaped us, we also need to consider the role that our social environments have played.
Right. Our personalities, our values, even our quirks and habits all bear the marks of the groups that we've belonged to, from our childhood friends to our adult social circles. And recognizing that influence, I think, can be both empowering and humbling.
Empowering because it suggests that we actually have the potential to change and grow.
Yeah.
By seeking out new social connections and experiences. We're not fixed by our past.
Exactly. We have the agency to shape our own social environments, to choose the groups we belong to, and even influence their norms and values. It's this ongoing dynamic process.
But humbling, too, because it reminds us that we're not as independent or self-made as we might like to think. We're deeply connected to the social fabric of our lives.
That's right. We carry the imprints of those connections. And that realization, I think, can cultivate a sense of empathy and understanding. It connects us to the broader human experience.
So maybe the nurture assumption isn't just about child development. Maybe it's about understanding what it means to be human, to be these social creatures woven into this intricate dance between our individual selves and the groups we belong to.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it leaves us with a sense of wonder and a desire to keep exploring these complexities, to question our assumptions and learn from the rich tapestry of human experiences all around us.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Challenged conventional wisdom, unpacked complex research, and hopefully sparked some new ways of thinking about how we become who we are.
Yeah, and if you're intrigued by these ideas, I highly encourage you to read The Nurture Assumption yourself. It's a really thought-provoking journey that challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about human nature.
And as you reflect on these concepts, think about the groups that have shaped your own life, the norms that you've internalized, and the ways you've both conformed to and challenged those influences. It's a fascinating path of self-discovery.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the nurture assumption.
We'll catch you next time for another mind-bending exploration of the world of ideas.